Welcome everyone to this full summary study. Let's just jump right in. I want you to start by picturing a scene with me, okay? Imagine ancient, glowing texts, carefully inscribed on parchment, just buried away and hidden beneath the sweeping sands of time for centuries. Now, for generations, the story of how these texts and early inscriptions came to be has been accepted as a totally fixed, unmovable timeline. But what happens when historians decide to dust off these ancient words and take a much, much closer look?
Well, that brings us to the central mystery we're investigating today. What if the earliest Islamic inscriptions, the ones literally carved into stone, meant something completely different when they were first written? Go ahead and put on your historical detective hats, because today we're embarking on a pretty amazing investigation, looking at evidence that might actually force us to rethink an entire historical setting. Our analysis today is drawn from a deeply fascinating breakdown originally presented by the YouTube channel Events and History. I highly recommend checking out their full work, and you can find a link to that exact source right below the study. Also, before we really get going, TGC invites the true brethren to become Ecclesia members of this channel, The Gospels Compared. Extra content will be available, and brethren members may request a summary video of their choice. Membership is literally just the price of an ice cream a month. All right, let's dive right into this. Section 1, the Dome of the Rock. So right out of the gate, we hit our first massive roadblock. Scholars face a really profound challenge when trying to understand this era of history, and it's basically the danger of reading 7th century evidence, like those famous inscriptions from 691 AD, through a much later 9th century theological lens. See, when the Abbasid Caliphate was establishing its doctrines in the 9th century, they had a very specific worldview. The researchers in our source material argue that historians have essentially taken those 9th century meanings and retroactively pasted them onto 7th century texts, completely ignoring an even older history that dates all the way back to the 4th century. Let's look at one specific example of this: Tawhid. This is the concept of the absolute oneness of God. Now, traditionally, historians and scholars have largely believed that this concept, at least in the specific phrasing we see today, was uniquely introduced on the Dome of the Rock by Abd al-Malik in the late 7th century. It was basically viewed as a brand new declaration, separating a newly emerging faith from the surrounding Christian Byzantine world. But, as it turns out, the historical record is much, much deeper than that. Which brings us to Section 2, a 4th century Greek discovery. Get this, the scholar Shlomo Pines notes an absolutely stunning connection. He points out that a Greek form of the Tawhid exists in the Pseudo-Clementine Homilies. It reads, "God is one, there is no God except him." Now that phrase was circulating in Greek and Syriac a full 300 years before the Dome of the Rock was ever built. These were actually slogans being used in intense theological debates centuries earlier. And the geography here is equally fascinating. These ancient homilies weren't just written in a vacuum. They originated in an area known in Greek as Koli Syria, which translates to Hollow Syria. This perfectly corresponds to the Buck-Ah Valley, nestled between the Lebanon and the anti-Lebanon mountain ranges. That is literally just a stone's throw from Damascus. So why does that matter? Well, because Damascus is exactly where Abd al-Malik was ruling when he commissioned the Dome of the Rock. These 4th century texts were right there in his intellectual backyard, easily accessible in both Greek and Syriac. Let's unpack that a bit more. Section 3, decoding the early Shahada. Now, what's really interesting is when you compare the texts side by side, the similarities are just striking. The 7th century rock inscription states, "There is no God but God alone, he has no associate." Meanwhile, those 4th century Clementine homilies declare, "God is one, there is no God except him." Think about it. When you say God is one, you are inherently saying he has no associate. The scholars are arguing here that the inscription isn't some newly invented theological concept, but actually a direct borrowing from older Judeo-Christian slogans that had already been in the region for over 3 centuries. And the context of those older slogans? Absolutely crucial. These weren't just generalized prayers, right? They were specific arguments, polemics. Scholars point out they were likely revised by an Arian theologian. At that time, Arian Christians strongly opposed Trinitarian Christians. So these slogans were basically anti-Trinitarian weapons, targeting anyone who elevated Jesus to the status of divinity. They actually called the Trinitarians associators for, associating a partner with God. So the suggestion here is that when Abd al-Malik used these phrases on the Dome of the Rock, he was just utilizing a well-known pre-existing local argument against Trinitarian Christians. Moving right along, Section 4,
translating the praised servant.
So if we look through a 9th century lens, this text is read as a proper noun, Muhammad is the prophet of God. But researchers analyzing the exact same text in its 7th century Syriac and Arabic context argue the term was actually being used as a gerund, like an honorific title. In its original historical and grammatical context, they translate it to mean, praise be the servant of God. That would be a direct reference honoring Jesus Christ, emphasizing that he is a servant of God, not God himself. Again, this fits perfectly into that ongoing anti-Trinitarian debate of the era, rather than announcing a new prophet.
Next up, Section 5, Islam as divine concord.
The traditional view, which is what many of us have been taught, is that this marks the formal introduction of a brand new religion with a capitalized proper noun, Islam. But scholar Christoph Luxemburg's linguistic analysis offers a super compelling alternative. He translates the word al-Islam in this specific 7th century context not as a proper noun for a new religion, but as a descriptive noun. It meant conformity, agreement, or concord with Scripture. So the text is essentially saying that only those in concord or agreement with God's Scripture can be saved. To put that into perspective, the researchers provide this fantastic analogy to show how languages naturally evolve. Think of the word orthodox. Originally, that was just an adjective meaning right belief, used to describe someone in conformity with the church. But over centuries, that descriptive word shifted. It hardened into a proper noun and became the actual name of a distinct Christian denomination. The scholars argue this exact same linguistic evolution happened with the word Islam between the 7th and 9th centuries.
Bringing it all together now, Section 6, Reading through 7th century eyes.
So what does this all mean for us? Well, the methodology moving forward is clear. First, we must contextualize these inscriptions historically. Second, we have to avoid that 9th century theological retrojection. We just cannot force later ideas into earlier texts. Third, we have to trace these texts back to their Greek and Syriac origins in the Levant. And finally, we absolutely must understand the political and religious polemics of that exact time. Rather than seeing these inscriptions as isolated evidence of a new religion just dropping out of the sky, we should view them as part of a deeply interconnected intellectual world stretching all across Syria, a world that was incredibly rich with ongoing debates about the nature of God.
Which really leaves us with this final, massive, provocative question. If the Shahada, the identity of the praised servant, and the word Islam itself were all originally rooted in much older Judeo-Christian debates, how much of 7th century history has been completely painted over by 9th century theology? It's an incredible question, and one that truly shifts our perspective on the past. Thank you so much for joining me for this study today. If you found this as fascinating as I did, I highly encourage you to click the link below to dive even deeper into the original source from events and history. Keep asking great questions and keep learning.